As we are on the eve of the Italian macro Zerg Reynor competing in his GSL group against Hiro Su and Gumiho, I wanted to take a look back and reflect upon other foreigners competing in GSL, because the GSL is the most prestigious tournament. It's the one that means the most. If you were to ask all the StarCraft pros, old school, new school, how do they imagine themselves in their mind's eye when they wanted to be a pro gamer, when they were climbing up through Diamond and into Masters and climbing up GM and improving and losing those early lands? The dream is always to win a GSL, and it seems pretty much unfathomable. The GSL has been around since StarCraft 2 came out in summer of 2010. There were 3 GSL Opens. That's where we saw the most foreigners compete. The highest number of non-Koreans were in those first 3 GSLs before they switched to Code S format. This is a game from that era. Idra versus MVP, MVP at the peak of his powers, Idra near the peak of his powers. Absolutely incredible. One of my favorite games ever, and it's on Steps of War, the smallest map in StarCraft 2 history, and an incredibly Terran-favored map. And Idra was certainly someone who was in this early era. To quote him, it was him along with Fruit Dealer, aka Cool, 100 MMR above everyone else on the ladder in these first couple of seasons. Zerg, of course, very weak early on in StarCraft's life. This was also a metagame that favored a lot of rushy play and meant that if you were trying to play a macro style, you were at a disadvantage. Of course, whenever games first come out, rushy play is something that is favored a little bit more because obviously it's way harder to figure out intricate defensive macro play than it is just building a bunch of tier 1 units and attacking someone, right? Genro is a guy who fell victim to this. As Idra once pointed out, because he was trying to figure out how to macro on Steps of War, he narrowly did not qualify for the first 2 GSL Open seasons. And poetically, Genro would make round of 4 in GSL January 2011, the first Code S, proving that yes, not only was he good enough to compete with the Koreans, which he proved throughout his career, but it was that higher learning curve of a macro style that meant that he didn't qualify for those first 2 GSLs. And Genro had an incredible impact on macro Terran, as we see MVP attempt a sucker punch knockout blow. No neutral depots, remember. It was so much easier to die as Zerg and get cheesed out. And that's what happened to Rhett early on in his GSL career. He was in GSL Season 3 along with Genro. That was the one that Genro qualified for first and started to make his name. And his 2011 Code S was sort of the peak of his GSL career. When we think about Rhett, this is the epitome of an intelligent, methodical, defensive macro player. A guy who plays the right way and certainly is going to look to make a plethora of workers before he looks to take a silly risk to try to catch you off guard. Playing defensive macro Zerg in early Wings of Liberty, it was the absolute worst time to play defensive macro Zerg. This was a style that not only was awful for the maps, but awful for the metagame. So whenever you look at an unforgiving tournament like GSL, a tournament that after the first 3 seasons, going into 2011, they weren't open qualifiers, and if you qualified, well, hey, you're going to have to go through Code A. You have to get, which is sort of like a lower level GSL. Think about guys like Slayers Yu-Gi-Oh! Or like OGS Top. These guys who were very good Korean players but weren't consistently top 32 in Korea. You had to do well in Code A to even qualify for Code S, which is of course what we love and watch now. Code S, the highest level, the most prestigious Korean tournament that everyone wants to win. And that was a big problem. You had guys like Huck come over a little bit later in 2012 and do very well. Well, Huck made a deep run in the season that the player Sniper won. Sniper, one of the most forgotten players in GSL history. Well, the next season in the group selection, Sniper picked Huck to be in his group, and then they played the opening match and Sniper defeated Huck. Well, since Huck got knocked out of that season in a the next series, I believe, against a Terran player was very close and Huck narrowly lost. Well, then it was like, okay, Huck, you're going to have to play in Code A next season because you lost in the round of 32, not the round of 8. And if you do good in Code A, then, okay, you get another shot at Code S round of 32. It makes a lot more sense for a very popular guy like Huck to say, well, rather than wait 2.5 months in Korea and not be able to efficiently play all these other foreigner tournaments, MLG, DreamHack, IPL, because remember, it's like a 12-hour plus plane ride from Korea. And if you're seriously preparing for GSL, you can't really be flying off playing in foreigner tournaments. So guys like Huck and Idris said to themselves, the way that the Code S formatting is very unforgiving, and it means that I'm all in on Code S, and if I fail to qualify or get cheesed out and bomb out in the round of 32, I've missed a lot of opportunities. I didn't go to that MLG that was a week before my GSL games because I didn't want to be jet lagged. I didn't want to show off my best builds a million times at MLG, and my Korean opponent who stayed in Korea and played against his teammates, he has access to all those builds because some of his teammates went to that LAN and were able to stand behind Idra and even see the off-stream games as a Blue Flame Hellion push is coming out. Remember, the GSL is a tournament that you prepare for as a player. You know who your opponents are. And you basically come up with builds that you think are going to work best against them specifically. It's not like a weekend MLG where you don't know who you're going to play and maybe you have some standard macro builds that you've perfected. But ultimately, if you have to face a crazy opponent, you don't have time to go into the lab and come up with sniper builds, a weird proxy, a weird cheese. Because obviously in StarCraft, even if you're a pro gamer, there are going to be times where you go into the match thinking, well, holy crap, how am I going to beat this guy? MVP at this time was at the very top of the Korean server by a lot and was the best player in the world and was truly terrifying. Was Idris scared of him? No, he went toe to toe with him in a Steps of War macro game. When we consider what some of the other foreigners did, Dan Artosis competed in some of the early GSLs, but of course the time commitment of casting ultimately curtailed what he could do. I've casted his GSL win as part of my Venomous Classic series, his GSL game win as part of my Venomous Classic series. And this was a guy who had a few series where, wow, he's way ahead and looks really good, and then he dies to DT. It's like a classic Artosis ladder game. Liquid Hey Pro is a name that I'm sure 9 out of 10 of you don't even know, and the one person that does remember it probably doesn't remember any of his games. Hey Pro was a Team Liquid Cat, a macro Zerg, who famously got cheesed by one of the most infamous Korean players in StarCraft history, Bit by Bit Prime. Bit by Bit Prime was this absurd, pure cheese and abuse early Wings of Liberty player who would exclusively do ludicrous one base all-ins, and because the game was so volatile and the maps were so small, he would actually win. His signature one is the 2 Rax Marine all-in, where he does the initial bunker rush, and if it, regardless of whether it succeeds or fails, he'll make 8 more Marines and then pull all of his workers and attack again. So you'll hear like workers being pulled, sometimes colloquially referred to as like, oh, bit by bit. That's who that's a reference to. And many of these super cheesy Terran players disappeared very quickly into 2011 as the game became more balanced. Hey Pro was a guy who got cheesed by bit and was never really able to recapture his footing in the GSL. Artosis hilariously and famously once said, I might not have made it as far in GSL as Bit by Bit did, but I know more about StarCraft than he does. And in many ways, that's sort of like a microcosm for how foreigner participation was in the early StarCraft 2 days, where, yeah, you had guys like Idra and Rhett who were legitimate top-end players, like top 20 in the world players at the time. And if you think, oh, come on, top 20. In this era, they would literally win lands that had some of the best Koreans at them. And of course, Idra would make deep runs into GSL, Genro would make deep runs into GSL, Huck would make a deep run into GSL. And once you get to the Code S era, outside of this extremely early time, it gets to a point where the non-Korean pro gamers really realize it's more lucrative and it's honestly better for me, popularity-wise, to play these non-Korean tournaments and meet the Western fans and get to play other non-Koreans, and then later in the tournament I get to play a Korean opponent. But I don't start the tournament playing Su, Gumiho, and Hiro. You know what I mean? Like, there's levels to this stuff. For instance, at that famous MLG match, Idra played Boxer, and then he went on to play MVP Tails. Okay, well, those are two big, interesting names, and those were great, exciting matches. However, like, their peak power level at the time, or their power level at the time, wasn't as high as like MVP or Nesty. Yeah, they were in GSL, but they were like more round of 32 caliber players. It would be like if you were watching a game and you saw Ragnarok as opposed to Dark or Rogue. Like, yes, he's a very talented Korean player that's made deep runs. However, he's not an absolute knuckle duster. So as we looked into the Heart of the Swarm era, sort of transitioning, like Idra had left in 2011, and Huck had done some damage in 2012, and another guy who did some damage was Naniwa. This was a guy who really had a commitment to practice, and unfortunately for him, before one of the defining matches of his career, the round of 8 match against MVP in his GSL run, the Korean opponents that he was doing private matches with sort of duplicitously went behind his back and shared his replays with MVP. So MVP sort of knew what was coming. Although that was MVP at the peak of his powers, that would have been very difficult to win anyway. Part of why GSL is such a big deal, and it's worth staying up very late into the night for, and if we sort of reflect on our past as StarCraft fans, I'm sure many of you over the course of the last 15 years have been in some sort of school where your schedule's a little more flexible. I remember so many times staying way up late, because of course if it occurs in Korea at night, it's at like 5 a.m. US. I remember staying up late when these exciting groups were occurring, and you would watch your favorite players play live if you could, but the groups that you really stood up late and really wanted to see live with the live stream chat were the groups with the foreigners. And whenever we think about those sort of groups, as Idris screams in with Mutiling Bling here, going into the Heart of the Swarm era, two names jump out, and that's Scarlet and Neeb. Neeb also made round of 4, which if you don't know, that's the furthest a non-Koreans ever made is round of 4. No one's ever made a finals. And Neeb went toe-to-toe with the top-end Zerg player and was defeated. However, when we think about Neeb as a player, this is a guy who is an incredibly talented Protoss and has made a crap load of round of 4s and done real damage at foreigner tournaments for years and years and years. His round of 8 in GSL is to me one of his most impressive achievements. So I absolutely love to cheer for the non-Koreans in GSL, and in many ways, Scarlet defined that era because Neeb made that incredibly deep round of 4 run, but whenever I think of a non-Korean competing in GSL over the last few years, I think of Scarlet. She might have had that brutal series in the round of 8 against Sue, that ZVZ best of 5 that lasted like 15 minutes. And there was another series she had against Alive that I remember that I'm sort of, in retrospect, remembering a game with lots of Widow Mines and Liberators that was very close. But that was a player that we could really look to as foreigner fans and say, oh, she has a legitimate shot, especially if she gets TVZs to play. Scarlet, of course, incredible creep spread. For my money, the best creep spread in StarCraft history. Juanito, aka Special Major, this is a guy who was also looked at as a legitimate threat, and a guy who was punching around like the high round of 16 level. Unfortunately, whenever I think of Major's GSL games, there are also a couple sort of tragic, very close games that I look back on and think like, wow, like he was right there. There was one game against a Protoss player, a macro Protoss, it might have been Stats, it was years ago, where Major was just unfathomably far ahead in a 1-1 series, and he just kept trying to push stubbornly with Bio up into disruptors. And one thing about StarCraft on LAN that's different from online is sometimes you can really see like someone's nerves come out. And when I say nerves, I don't mean like, oh, like people are watching me, I'm scared. What it really is like, oh my God, I'm about to be round of 8 in GSL. And then it's sort of like, all I need is one more attack. And then you do the big attack, and it's sort of like, okay, it didn't work. I'm still ahead though. I just need to do one more good attack to win. And then you do the attack and you're falling a little bit, and then the game starts to slip through your fingers. It feels like the sand starts to slip through your fingers. And those are brutal games, the ones where you're right there and you end up losing. And it means so much for us non-Korean fans to be able to stay up and watch a non-Korean compete in the GSL, because even though Nick and Dan aren't commentating it anymore, for over a decade, this was definitively the most important tournament, and the one that if you were a pro gamer, you really wanted to win. So even though the GSL might not be around as long as, I mean, for years it was the mainstay, right? Nick and Dan, like, it was going to be around forever. Well, they were god tier for well over a decade. There they are. And we're sort of reaching a point where it's not Nick and Dan anymore. So the I'm not sitting here saying dead game, but, let's be honest, the GSL, StarCraft, it is Nick and Dan. And this is sort of the Foreigners' last chance to win a GSL. So Reynor fighting, cheer hard for Reynor, and let's just think about, consider, and pay respects to all the great Foreigner players who went out there in the GSL and did their best to try to compete and make a deep run in the most difficult tournament in esports. Stay easy, guys.